When one of Jehovah's Witnesses has committed what Watchtower considers a serious sin, a judicial committee is formed. The committee consists of 3 elders from the congregation of the accused. No outside observers can be brought in to support the person on trial, nor can any recording devices be used. Does this kind of committee and procedure fit with historical biblical precedent? Let's find out, starting with a pillar of Jewish history, Moses. According to the book of Exodus, when the Israelites were being led out of Egypt by Moses, he would act as their judge, hearing court cases and making decisions based on the testimony presented. In what setting were these trials held? Let's read Exodus chapter 18, verse 13 to find out. Moses sat down as usual to serve as judge for the people, and the people kept standing before Moses from morning until evening. Does this sound like a closed, secret meeting between Moses, the person on trial, and any witnesses? Clearly not. It was conducted in the open, in public, with many other people around listening in and awaiting their turn to be heard. Once the Israelites entered the Promised Land and the Mosaic Law was firmly established, did things change? Let's see by reading Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 18. You should appoint judges and officers for each tribe in all the cities, footnote, literally, inside all your gates, that Jehovah your God is giving you, and they must judge the people with righteous judgment. One change noted here is that instead of just the one judge, Moses, there were many judges in the cities. That footnote on the word cities is very important here. The phrase that's translated as cities is literally inside all your gates. That's because the court cases of early Israel were tried at the city gates, out in the open, in front of the public. Watchtower's encyclopedia, Insight on the Scriptures, Volume 1, verifies this. At the city gates, the older men of the city sat in judgment. Even kings at times held audiences or sat in judgment there. Because the judges, the prominent men of the city, the merchants, the businessmen, and a goodly number of people were usually at the gate, prophets often went there to make proclamations. Inasmuch as the gate was a news center, the good or bad works of the city's inhabitants would become known there. The city gates weren't the lonely outskirts on the edges of town, no. They were the bustling center of activity. The public at large could listen in, which kept the judges and the witnesses accountable for whatever was spoken during the trials. At this point you might be thinking, but that was the Old Testament. How are things handled in the New Testament? I'm glad you asked. Let's go forward in time to the Gospels. Notice how Jesus instructed the Christians to handle their disputes at Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 and 16. Moreover, if your brother commits a sin, go and reveal his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take along with you 1 or 2 more, so that on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses every matter may be established. Jesus was very explicit in the steps a person was to take if an issue or dispute arose within the congregation. First, you were to go and reveal the other person's fault between you and him alone. So a one-on-one meeting to try and set the person straight. If that failed, you were to take 1 or 2 more people with you in the hopes that they might be able to reason with the person and to act as witnesses to the refusal to listen if that turned out to be the case. 2 or 3 others. That sounds like the elders' judicial committee, right? Well, hold on there. We're not done yet. Now let's read the verse that follows, verse 17. If he does not listen to them, speak to the congregation. If he does not listen even to the congregation, let him be to you just as a man of the nations and as a tax collector. Jesus says in verse 17 that if the person does not listen to the group of 2 or 3, the next step is to speak to the congregation. This goes back to the open transparency of the Old Testament courts. It's too easy for justice to be perverted in a closed setting, even with 2 or 3 other people involved. So the case had to be taken into a public setting where everyone could hear the testimony from all parties involved. This greatly increased accountability, since others would remember what was said by the accused, the witnesses, and the judges. What about after Jesus died? Did this pattern of openness and transparency continue in the Christian congregation? Let's take a look at one last situation, this time in the book of Acts. In the 15th chapter of Acts, a group of converts from the Pharisees began teaching that Christians who were converted from the nations needed to get circumcised. Paul and Barnabas disagreed and disputed the issue with them. Following Jesus' instructions, when the dispute failed to be resolved on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, the matter was taken up before the congregation in Jerusalem. Notice what happens when they arrive there in verses 4 and 5 of Acts chapter 15. On arriving in Jerusalem, they were kindly received by the congregation and the apostles and the elders, and they related the many things God had done by means of them. But some of those of the sect of the Pharisees who had become believers stood up from their seats and said, "It is necessary to circumcise them and command them to observe the law of Moses." So, after arriving in Jerusalem, both groups presented their side in front of the entire congregation, in public. Afterward, the matter was taken up in front of what was very likely a large number of elders and the apostles at that time. Since there were 12 apostles, and Jerusalem was the center of Christian activity, there would have been at least a few dozen older men involved. This would be keeping with Jewish culture of the time. The Insight book, under the Sanhedrin entry, says that even the Jewish lower courts consisted of 23 members, and the Jewish high court, the Sanhedrin, had 71. More people meant more transparency. It also made it harder to bribe your way into a verdict in your favor. Watchtower claims that when the New Testament says the congregation, it means those appointed to responsible positions in governing the congregation. But as we've seen, that interpretation is nowhere to be found in the Old Testament, in Jesus' words, or in the actions taken when the issue of circumcision arose in the book of Acts. A small court of 3 men is not present in the history of the Jewish lower courts or the high court of the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem either. Even if it was possible to make the claim that a court of 3 elders is all the Bible requires, it's certainly not possible to claim that the Bible supports secret judicial meetings where observers are not allowed and recording devices are not allowed. All of the Bible accounts show an open, transparent setting for the courts that took place at the city gates or before the entire congregation. All of the Bible accounts except one. Yes, there is one famous or infamous closed secret trial that takes place in the New Testament, the trial of Jesus at the house of the high priest Caiaphas. And what does Watchtower say about this trial? Jesus' captors now led him to the home of high priest Caiaphas, where the illegal nighttime trial continued. Yes, Jesus' trial was illegal by Jewish standards. Watchtower is not wrong about this. According to Joseph Salvador, a 19th century Jewish scholar and author of the book History of the Institutions of Moses and the Hebrew People, an accused man was never subjected to private or secret examination. Based on all of the evidence, what verdict should we hand down for whether Watchtower is breaking Jewish and Christian law by holding secret trials consisting of only 3 elders in a closed setting where no observers or recording devices are allowed for transparency? Innocent or guilty?